Okay, in this tutorial we're going to cover how to take our 3D object and put it into a game engine, which we'll be using Unity 5 for this one. Right now we have a 3D sword that we've worked on. We've built it in 3D space, and we've already gone through and textured it. If we pull up the, actually it's down here, but UV editor, it pulls up the UVs, and we've already done that, and we've already colored it in Photoshop. So we've already assigned a material to it in the hypershade. So now we just have to do a couple cleanup things before we send it out into the game engine. Let's say the first thing I want to do is, I guess let's go to the model. We want to delete out the history. So I'm going to go to Edit, Delete by Type History with the sword selected. And that clears out the history, makes it a bit cleaner. We also want to make sure that the origin point is centered, so right now it is. But if for some reason it was sitting way out here, you can see it's not centered to the world, so when it pops in the game engine, it'll pop in a bit off center. And these numbers are also, we want to erase these numbers. So if I go over to Modify, Erase Transformations, it'll erase those numbers. But we kind of want the sword to be centered on the world grid before we export it out. So I'm going to go recenter this back. And if you wanted to snap it to the grid to make sure it's perfectly accurate, you can hold the X key on the keyboard and the middle mouse scroll wheel. Just click that right here, and it should pop your sword right there. So X is going to be your grid snap. Once you've done that, I'm going to slide this a little bit higher above the grid. Alright. And where this origin point is kind of where the object will pop into Unity, also in relation to your world grid. But either way, I'm going to erase out that. So Modify, Erase Transformations, and that zeroes it. So now we're nice and clean, and it's snapped to there. But as long as it's somewhere in the world area, it should be okay. Alright, so now we have this. The next thing we want to do, we should probably name this. So I'm going to take pcube1, and I'm going to call this one sword. Alright, so I have a sword name. I also want to go through and name the texture. So let's pull up the hypershade, which is going to be over Window, Rendering Editor, Hypershade. You can also just go to the attribute editor if you want. I'm going to take this Lambert, click on it, and double click, and it pops open here. We can see we have the Lambert texture on here. I'm going to rename this to Texture Sword. So I know it's the sword texture. And over here we have the color. And this one is set to a PSD, but I want to use a Targa file for the game engine. So let's minus that. Jump over to Photoshop, where we last left this. Right now it's saved as a PSD. So I'm going to go Save As and call this a Targa file. So change PSD to Targa. You could use TIFF. You could also use bitmap. But Targa will give you good quality, or perfect quality. So we'll go Targa. And I can call this, let's call it the same thing I called the material. So Texture Sword. Alright, and we'll save that to the desktop so I can find it easier. And it's going to ask which resolution do you want. 24 is probably the best one for the moment. 32-bit will give you transparency such as this checker pattern, but I don't need transparency on the sword. So I'm going to skip the 32 and save the file size and just go 24. So press OK. And that should save the desktop. Minimize that. So back to here. I'm going to change this location to the desktop. But we're not getting the option to because we're set to the PSD. And we can't change out a PSD because we loaded this originally with the PSD. So cancel that. I need to go back to the main menu. So this button should pull us back to the main menu. Now if I need to get rid of this map. So right click on color and go to break connection. And now I can go back and attach using File instead of PSD this time. So File, go to the folder and say I want to go Desktop, the Texture Sword Targa. Open that and it should pop back on there. So now instead of using PSD, we're using a Targa file. So we're good there. I can go back to, oops, this way, or I lost it. Click back off there and back on here. So Texture Sword. So that's attached here now, so we're all good. And because we put the material name the material will automatically go into Unity, and because we've assigned which material it is, the texture will also go into Unity, but we have to drag the file into Unity as well. But the material will come with the FBX file we export. All right. The next thing to take into note is that let's go to Windows, Settings and Preferences. If we go over to Settings, Maya at the moment is set to centimeters. Centimeters is probably going to work for us. Inches is going to give you a lot of decimal point numbers and other such foot and yards. Meters is kind of large but can work. Centimeters is kind of small but can work. I think Unity runs just in between there under decameters, but since we don't have the option, I'm just going to go with centimeters, which is already default. So just, I guess, go with centimeters for now. So since mine's already there, I'm okay. All right, and I've already centered it to the grid. So everything should be in place now. It'll carry over the textures, materials. It already has the UVs on here, so we know that we're working, or it should work. All right, and so the next step is to export this. So we'll go File, Export Selection. Make sure it's selected first. Otherwise you could do Export All and spit everything out, but we're just going to export what we want. In this case is the sword. So Export Selection. And I'm going to call this, or put this on the desktop and call this sword. And make sure we do the FBX format. There's lots of different formats we can choose from. But FBX will carry over our materials, our objects. It should carry, I think, the rig, and it should also carry animations. We don't have any of that, but FBX is the format we want to use. So we'll export selection. All right, and that exports out. So now we just have to load up the game engine. To do that, assuming you don't have Unity installed yet, unity3d.com will pull up the Unity site. We can click on Get Unity 5. There's personal and professional options. Personal is free. Pro level is costs a little bit. So we're going to go to the free option. And then all you have to do is click this one for Download Installer, and it'll start downloading. I've already installed it on my system, so I don't need to go through that. Once you've downloaded it, also go to Additional Downloads for Windows and pick up these standard assets. It may or may not come with it by default, but once you've installed it, go through and add this also, and do this after you've installed it. Otherwise, you'll have to close down Unity and reopen it again because it won't appear there. All right, so I've already gone through and done that as well. So Unity is now installed. So I can go over to All Programs, Unity 5.0, and Unity. So this will load up the game engine, and it'll load up the most recently used projects. So I'm going to go through and make a new one. So let's go with New Project. I'm going to call this Sword Tutorial Project, and by default it wants to save. Let's pick a location. I'm going to call this Save to the Desktop. Select the folder, and we have the options of 3D and 2D. I want to use 3D for this, and you can go to Asset Packages and pick different ones in Unity. This is the standard assets that's already been downloaded, but I'm going to skip that and just use Unity or inside of Unity Editor, grab that. So all you need is the title, the location, 3D, and create project. And this will start opening up the Unity editor. By default, you could have lots of different window settings. I'm going to rearrange the window settings to make this a little easier to see. Some of these tabs I don't have open, so I don't need them. If I grab the name, I can drag it until somewhere hovers in the middle of the screen like so. And then I can press X and close that out. And repeat, drag this here, close that, I don't need those windows. Hierarchy, I'm going to drag right next to project. This puts it in the same one, but I can also separate that and make it its own column. So now I have hierarchy and project, just two separate ones. Project, you may see this by default is set to 2 columns, so you might get this. I usually like to use the 1 column. It's kind of easier for me. I'm going to go to this little area on the right and go set it to 1 column, and that makes it a little easier to see. Alright, and I guess the difference between project and hierarchy: project is everything in your entire game. Hierarchy is what's in your scene or your level. So the project could contain all the data, all the game assets, all the levels, everything, music, everything. Whereas you only need for level 1 the character and a couple objects, so you'd have this in the hierarchy or the scene. And then when you're ready to build your second scene, this will be empty again for your second scene, and you start building new stuff in here. So hierarchy is your current existing objects. So the main camera is existing in the scene right now, and the directional light. But there's nothing in our project folder, so we need to go add some stuff to that. And then last thing to mention, we have the game mode right here, so what we're seeing in game, and this is the editor, so I can see that there's nothing in the editor. If I press play at the moment, you'll see that nothing happens. We're looking at a blank world. All we have is a camera looking and light shining, but there's nothing else existing in the world. I'm going to press play to turn that off. Make sure you don't work in play mode because it won't save, or generally doesn't save. So once that's turned off, I could put this, let's say, I could put the tab right next to scene mode. So right now when I'm in scene, I can press play and it'll default right into game mode. Otherwise, and you can switch back and forth between scene and game, but I like to put the game mode outside of it, so I click back to scene. So I can slide this over here and work, and then I can also slide it out to here, see the game, and slide back and forth. And I can also look at things in the editor while the game's playing. But it's all personal preference. I'm going to slide it over there for now. Alright, so the next thing I want to do, now we've established how to use this, I guess cover how to move, rotate, and scale, but we're going to want an object to do that. But it's the same thing as Maya. If you hold the Alt key and left mouse button, you can spin around the screen. Holding Alt and middle mouse will pan the screen, and zoom is scroll wheel. So the same steps as Maya, and move, rotate, scale. So move, rotate, scale is WER, just like Maya, so it's pretty universal. Alright, so let's go over to game object, and or assets, import new asset. We want to pull in the sword, so import new asset, and I'm going to grab the sword FBX that we've created. Import that, and it won't pop in your scene, but it'll pop into your project. The materials also come through because we created a material called texture sword in Maya. It automatically came through and populated in the material folder. We want to keep things organized, so I'm going to go create a new folder, and I'm going to call this models. When you start to build large levels, I'm going to drag this guy into the models folder. You're going to get a lot of content, and it's much easier if you keep things organized from the beginning. So I have materials in the materials folder, models in the models folder. I'm going to need a couple more folders as we go through. I'm going to create, let's say, another folder called textures. And I need to bring in the sword texture. But for now, let's say I take the sword and I drag it into the scene, and you can see it's kind of microscopic. If I click on the sword, scale factor is set to 1, which is fine, but the original Maya file has a 0.01 scale, so it's 10 times smaller than what we're used to seeing in Maya, so it looks a little small there. Instead of building the entire world that small, which I could do, I can set this to, let's say, 10, and that should scale it up. Once I scroll down here and press apply, and that puts it back into what we're more used to seeing. If you wanted to just leave everything at 1 from Maya's original scale, you could do that. A lot of things are going to, the character, when we put him in there, is going to be a bit larger. By setting the scale factor to 10 for every object, it kind of works pretty similar. Alright, but also of note, we don't have any texture in here, so we need to import that as well. So I'm going to click on the texture folder and make that active so it imports right into there. Otherwise, it'll import into any folder that's currently highlighted, or no folders if it's nothing highlighted. So textures, go to assets, import new asset, and I'm going to grab the texture sword targa. Press import, and because it's already the same name, it should be pretty simple. So we'll go to the materials, the texture sword. The material is different than the texture. The material gets applied to the object, the texture gets applied to the material. So the materials are like shaders, just like in Maya where you have the Lambert. So this is kind of that Lambert, where you can have lots of different textures, normal maps, bump maps, specular maps, texture maps, all kinds of stuff applied to it, and you can see it's all listed up here. So we need to take the texture, which is the image, and attach it to this shader. You can see it says shader right there. So I'm going to take this, because the material is selected, not the texture, so click the material, and then I can click and drag this to the albedo, and then it colors it. And there we go, it's a colored model. If you wanted to click this little bullet point, you can try and find it in your scene, or you could just drag it like I did into the maps. Alright, so now we have the sword colored and sitting inside the game engine. The only thing we need to do now is, well, we can take a look at it for now. And it's playing, but we can't really do anything. We can't interact, we can't zoom in. All we have is just an image on the screen. So let's stop the playback. We want to go through, and in order to put a character in there, we're going to also want a ground plane so he doesn't keep falling. So I'm going to go to Game Object, 3D Object, and I'm going to drop a plane down on the world. So boom, we have a plane now that the character can walk on. I'm going to go grab the sword that's sitting in our scene. I'm going to go to Move, and I'm going to slide this down so it's kind of on the ground. Alright, and by default the scale is set to 1 because that's what we put it in Maya, or came from Maya. I'm going to call this plane by clicking on it and rename this to ground plane to keep things organized so I know what things are. Let's go drop a character in there now. So let's go to Assets, Import Package, and here's the standard package, the standard assets that came with that extra additional download from the Unity site. If you didn't download that, or you don't see that here, that's where that came from. You just have to go and download that, and if you don't see it after you download it, just close the program, and then when you reopen the program, all this will turn back on. Alright, make sure you save before you close. So let's go Import Package. Let's pull in the Characters package. This will take about a few seconds to decompress, and then it'll pop up over here with all the assets inside of that package. So package means it contains multiple things. We're just going to say yes to everything for now, just bring everything in there, but you could selectively go through and pick certain things. So I'm going to press Import, and this might take 10 seconds or so to bring in all these different assets, and it should populate inside the project folder. Again, not the scene because it wasn't dropped into the scene, it was incorporated into the entire game project. Almost there. Alright, so I'm going to minimize models and materials, keep things organized, and the textures. So we now have a standard assets folder. So I'm going to expand that out, and we see characters, expand that out, and I'm going to use first person, which is probably the easiest one to use. Expand that out, and take prefabs, expand that out, and take the first person controller and drag him into the scene. As you can see here, he's kind of halfway into the ground, so let's pull him above the ground so he doesn't fall through the ground. And you can see he's pretty proportional to the size of the sword. So if you wanted to make the sword, maybe we should have made it just a little smaller in Maya. But as you can see here, the scales work pretty well. When you send them back and forth, if you set it to 10 to begin with. Alright, let's slide this over here. And the mouse, when you move it, will move your camera for you. So I'm going to spin around until I see the sword. And your arrow keys will move you, or the WASD will move as well. So it makes it quite easy when you can spin the mouse around and kind of look at what you're looking at. You may also note that when I walk up to the sword, I can walk right through it. There is no collision on the sword. We'll have to add that as well. So let me unplay the game, or turn that off. Before I add collision, let's, in case you wanted to do a third person, we can take this guy here and delete him out. First person controller, gone. Don't delete him out of your project, just the one in the scene. You want to leave that in your project. So let's minimize that and pull up the third person in case you want to use third person. Prefabs. Prefab was already contained with all these scripts and everything. The model is just going to be a statue. So third person controller, drag this into the scene. I'll put him right in front of the sword. Alright, and you can see that we now have a character in the scene. If I were to press play at this point, he's a little bit different than the first person controller. When I start moving, he moves, which is great, but the camera doesn't follow him, so that's kind of a little confusing. So we're going to want to attach the camera to him. In order to do that, we take the camera and we parent it or attach it to the character. So all you have to do is take the camera, drag it so you see it highlighted, not kind of in between, but highlighting on there, and it'll drop it inside of the character. So now if I minimize, you can see the camera is attached to the character. We also want to go through and move the camera to a position that looks a little more realistic. So I'm going to move the camera right up behind him, kind of center him, go a little above him, and then rotate it, kind of looking a little more downwards angle on him. Alright, and then let's go and play. Alright, so I can move around, I can look, but unlike the first person controller, the third person doesn't give you the option when my mouse moves, it doesn't move the screen view. So I can walk around and I can jump with spacebar, which is pretty cool, but it's hard to kind of look around and explore your level. So you may be better off with the first person controller for now. It would take a little while to code the guy a little bit differently. Alright, so the next step is we want to make sure that he can't walk through the sword, that there is collision on the sword. So let's minimize that. I'm going to click off of him and then click on the sword. F on the keyboard will frame it or fit, just like Maya, so I can look at what we see here. Alright, the next thing I want to do is add collision. If you have extra components, each of these that expand out are components on your object. If I don't need an animated component, the sword's not being animated, I can right click and remove that component. In this case I want to also add something. Add component, physics, and I want a box collider. So if I add the box collider, you'll see here that it puts a collision green box around the sword, so the character can't walk through the green. If for some reason you wanted the green box to be a little smaller, you can go over here to the size of it. In this case I'm going to want, let's say, the red X. So the X size, I'll shrink that in to, let's say that's the collision. And you can make it whatever you want. So if I click off of there, you can see that it deselects off of the sword. If I press play, when the character walks up to the sword, he won't be able to walk through the sword. There's now collision on the sword. Just be careful not to fall off the edge of the world, because you'll fall forever, because there's no way to stop. So we'll just turn that off. Alright, so I'll put the sword in the scene. The next thing we want to cover is the concept of prefab. I'm going to I'll leave third person in there for now. The close out standard assets, I'm going to make a new folder called Prefabs. A prefab is an instance of an object in the scene. So if I have multiple of these swords and for some reason I change the size, scale, texture, collision box, whatever I change on it, I'd have to do it to every one of these swords in the scene. So if you put a bunch of rocks in your scene and you want to make sure the collision is a little bit smaller, you'd have to go and find every rock you put in your scene and change it. But if you make a prefab, you only have to change it once, and everything in your scene that's the same object will automatically update. So prefabs are probably the more common thing to use, so don't just always drag your model into the scene, because you'll have to reattach a lot of the objects or collision and all that stuff. So we're going to take the sword, and I'm going to drag it from the hierarchy window into the project, into the prefab folder. By doing so, it creates a prefab. The prefab is a blue box, and the model has a white paper or something next to it. So I'm going to use the prefab. It also tells me if it's a prefab by clicking on the sword, and you can see that it says prefab up here. So now I know it's a prefab. And if I were to take this prefab and drag it into the scene and click on it, you see that it has the collision box already attached to it. And if I go to the prefab right here, and I say I want that collision to be a little bit larger, let's say. Let's go that direction. You see it changes everything in the scene. So whatever I change on one will change everything. I could alternatively, let's say, change this guy. So if I change him to a collision box of 0.25, makes it smaller, it doesn't change him. You can change things uniquely inside of the scene, but if you change the prefab inside of the project, it changes everything. So you can also take this and say, I want this to be the norm. Every sword that exists, I want this to be the norm. And I can press apply from inside of the hierarchy scene, and that now applies it to everything. So everything gets changed, which can be not as beneficial using the apply button. Let's say I scale this guy and then I rotate him. This becomes the norm now. If I press apply, he scales. The rotating positions may not become the norm of applying, but the scale will apply to everything. So it may not always be beneficial to use the apply button. Sometimes it's just best to change it in the prefab settings right here. So if I set this back to 1 by 1 by 1, it sets everything back. And I can also zero these out, but it won't make a difference. That's only if you're putting it or dragging it into the folder here. I'm going to zero this guy back out as well. Alright, and then let's move them over here. And so that's the benefit of setting them 0 in Maya, is that you can zero things back out pretty easily. Alright, so let's slide this guy over here next to the other sword. So I have two twin swords now, and I have our third person controller. I'm going to switch this guy back to first person so I can kind of use my directional mouse to look at things. So delete him out of the hierarchy, go back to standard assets, first person, prefab, drop first person in there, pull it up above the ground, and then press play. Alright, and we can see here that we have our swords. We can't walk through them because there's collision on them. I can still jump with the spacebar and move around, and my arrow, our mouse will look around and explore things for us. Alright, so after this point you can basically just keep importing objects and start building your scene. The last thing to cover is how to build your game so that you can create an executable, so that way you can send the game to someone else so that they can play it. So in order to create the executable, we have to have a scene first. So I'm going to create a new folder to keep things organized. Create folder. I'm going to call this scenes. Inside the scenes folder, I need to save my file. So file, save scene as, inside the scenes folder, let's call this the sword scene, save, and it should automatically pop into here. So this folder system is inside of the desktop as well. So if I go here to the sword tutorial project, everything that I have here inside assets should match what's inside of here. So you can always just drag and drop files inside of here. But also of note, when you're taking your files to and from class, home, to the school computer, whatever, you need the entire folder. Don't go inside and taking pieces out of it. You want to make sure that this being on the desktop, this entire folder goes with you. Inside is assets, and you have, like, let's say the scene. If you try and take just the scene, it's not going to work. The scene is going to say I'm missing my prefabs, my models, my materials, the character, the textures. I'm missing everything. It's an empty scene. You don't have anything. So if you want to keep everything, you need to make sure you take this entire folder with you. And also, you want to make sure that it's easier to transfer this if you compress it first. So right click and go to send to compressed zipped folder, and this will zip it for you, and then you can drop it onto Google Drive, or you can drop it onto your USB. Transferring or dragging it while it's still open can take a lot longer, and don't run this from your USB once it's on there. When you get to class, take your folder or your compressed folder and drag it off the USB onto the school's computer and work on it locally there. If you try and use this while on your USB drive, it's going to lag so much you're not going to be able to play your game. So for whatever reason, USBs lag when you run through them for a game engine, so don't just get it off your USB drive or Google Drive. Alright, so that covers that. Just make sure you keep this fully intact. Alright, now that we have that established, we just have to build the game. So we go over here to File, Build Settings, and the scene has to be added to the build, otherwise there's nothing to build. So Add Current, and because we've already saved it and called it Sword Scene as seen here, it can add to the scene. If you have multiple levels, you would just keep adding your scenes. I guess you could probably also drag and drop them into here as well. But we don't have any of the scenes at the moment. I'm going to use the PC version of this, and I could go to build settings and change some things, but I'm just going to build and see what happens. It's going to ask me where do I want to save the exe, the executable. I'm going to save it inside of the main project folder, and I'm going to call this the sword game, and save. Now it's going to take about 30 seconds or so to build the game. And when it finishes building, we should have a standalone executable that you can share with your friends or send to someone. Here's the exe, and the exe won't do anything by itself. You need the data folder to go with it. So if you ever send the game to someone, send the exe and the data folder with it, which is all contained in this case inside of the Sword Tour project. So it's just easier. You can see it's 173 megabytes, mostly because of that character controller and the standard assets. But yeah, right click, send to a compressed zip folder, and take it to class with you and take it back from there. The exe, if I were to click on this now, I usually like to run it windowed so I can close the X button when it's done. You can pick different settings, whatever setting you want to run it at. And I'm going to press play, and it'll launch the game. Drop my character in there. And you can see here that I can move around and explore. And I have a virtual environment and a game that I can play. And you can share with your friends and take home and show people what you've built. If you want to exit out of it, that's why I liked window mode. It's just easy to press the X at that point and you close it out. And that's pretty much everything you're going to need to start building your scenes and your environments. Also of note, if you have multiple swords in here, again, you can use, let's say, the scales, scale whatever you need to make things different. You've got rotate and move, so you can start compiling and composing your scene. You may also want this ground plane to be a little bit larger. You can use the scale button, or just go here and type some numbers, 10 by 10 by 10, so it's less likely you're going to fall off the edge of the world if you do that. And that should be about it. Alright, so the next thing, the last thing to do is, I guess, save again, and we're done.